Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow. So this is classified as weird fiction. It is generally seen as in the vein of people like Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft, people like this. It is weird. I'm going to be honest, though, I was actually kind of disappointed in this book. Partially, I think, because my expectations were of something that the book was not. So the story, the sort of mythos of The King in Yellow is that it is a book that drives anyone who reads it mad. And I'm not mad. No, so that's the thing, right? That's the whole shtick with The King in Yellow. The problem is, there's two The King in Yellows. There's the short story collection written by Chambers, and then there is the metafictional The King in Yellow. And The King in Yellow within the short stories does seem to drive characters mad. It is this eerie book that tells this sort of dark, I would say it seems from the hints we get about it, this sort of Lovecraftian story of sort of cosmic horror, right? And from the pages of The King in Yellow, madness, obsession, paranoia emerges. It almost has this... The book itself, within the short stories, seems to almost function as a plague. So in the short story, The Repairer of Reputations, for instance, we get a really good description of The King in Yellow. Some stories talk more about it, some stories talk less about it. But The Repairer of Reputations probably focuses the most on this book and most directly connects it to madness out of the stories that are in this collection. Now, this is the Penguin Weird Fiction version, which, based on the list of short stories in the Wikipedia entry about The King in Yellow, I think may, in fact, be an abridged version, because there's fewer, like if you look at the contents, there's fewer stories listed here than there are in Wikipedia. So maybe it's more horrific than I think it is, and I've just gotten an abridged version that I don't see as being marked anywhere as an abridged version. But what we get in The Repairer of Reputations, which in this edition is the most directly connected to madness, we get this passage here, which I think is so interesting for a couple of major reasons. So the narrator of this story, which is the first story in the collection, is recounting a time where he had fallen from his horse and been concussed, and there was a whole issue with him going into a mental asylum, and whether or not he's been cured, etc., etc. So, it says here, during my convalescence, I bought and read for the first time The King in Yellow. I remember after finishing the first act that it occurred to me that I had better stop. I started up and flung the book into the fireplace. The volume struck the barred grate and fell open on the hearth in the firelight. If I had not caught a glimpse of the opening words in the second act, I should never have finished it. But as I stood to pick it up, my eyes became riveted to the open page, and with a cry of terror, or perhaps it was of joy so poignant that I suffered in every nerve, I snatched the thing from the hearth and crept shaking to my bedroom, where I read it and reread it, and wept and laughed and trembled with a horror which at times assails me yet. This is the thing that troubles me, for I cannot forget Carcosa, where black stars hang in the heavens, where the shadows of men's thoughts lengthen in the afternoon, when the twin suns sink in the lake of Hali, and my mind will bear forever the memory of the pallid mask. I pray God will curse the writer as the writer has cursed the world with this beautiful, stupendous creation, terrible in its simplicity, irresistible in its truth, a world which now trembles before the king in yellow. When the French government seized the translated copies which had just arrived in Paris, London, of course, became eager to read it. It is well known how the book spread like an infectious disease from city to city, from continent to continent, barred out here, confiscated there, denounced by press and pulpit, censured even by the most advanced of literary anarchists. No definite principles had been violated in those wicked pages, no doctrine promulgated, no convictions outraged. It could not be judged by any known standard, yet, although it was acknowledged that the supreme note of art had been struck in The King in Yellow, all felt that human nature could not bear the strain, nor thrive on words in which the essence of purest poison lurked. The very banality and innocence of the first act only allowed the blow to fall afterwards with more awful effect. So there's a couple of things that I think are really, really interesting here. Again, the idea that this book evokes madness is ultimately borne out in The Repairer of Reputations, because we find that this narrator has become convinced that he is, and possibly he's been convinced by this very unusual chap who himself is quite possibly insane. And most of the other characters think he is insane. But the narrator has become convinced that he is a descendant of this royal line, and that by murdering his brother, who is the inheritor of the imperial throne, that the narrator can become emperor. So he ends up basically just killing a whole bunch of people at the end of the story, and he's clearly driven to this out of madness, brought about by reading this book, theoretically. So we've got that element. One thing that I think is really, really fascinating is this line, with a cry of terror, or perhaps it was of joy so poignant that I suffered in every nerve. This is what Jacques Lacan would later call jouissance. So this is a psychoanalytic concept. Lacan was a psychoanalyst, primarily active starting in the 50s, really. And jouissance is basically the idea of pleasure that exists at such a height that it becomes painful, that it pleasure or enjoyment that induces suffering from its very excessiveness. And it's a striking psychological concept, right? Because it's counterintuitive, right? We think of enjoyment as positive, pleasant, pleasurable, etc., etc. Whereas jouissance decidedly becomes unpleasant, and yet it is still pleasant, right? So it is that mixture of pleasure and pain in one complex and contradictory package. And because it is complex and contradictory, it is also psychologically challenging to sort of sort through that emotional experience. Now, the other thing, the more interesting thing, I think, the more sort of broad scale thing, from the perspective of Chambers' collection, is this idea that the book spread like an infectious disease from city to city, from continent to continent. The idea of a book as plague, I think, is really fascinating, actually. There's something Latourian about this. So Bruno Latour is a contemporary philosopher who was one of the key proponents of actor network theory. And basically the idea is that we should expand the concept of agency, that is, who and what can make choices and can act in the world beyond human beings and even beyond sentient animals, right? So often we think of human beings as having agency, we think of animals as having agency, but in a more limited way, because we tend to think that animals are more driven by instinct, whereas humans are more driven by rational decision making. Whether or not that's entirely true, I think biological science is somewhat cautious, but that's the way we tend to think of things, right? And what Latour does, he comes along and he says, actually, maybe we should start thinking about non-living things, spaces, places, structures, etc., as also having agency. So, not only does that mean things like plants, and there is increasing biological evidence that plants, funguses, moss, things like this, communicate and maybe even make rational decisions, choose things, etc., convey information. But Latour also talks about things like places, spaces, rocks, geological formations, waterways, etc., as having agency, as acting in the world, as impressing upon things external to themselves in particular purposeful ways. The same thing we may say is true of ideas or concepts or values, things like this. And in this case, in The King in Yellow, the King in Yellow itself has this sort of agency, right? It seems to take on a life of its own and to go where it wants to go, to do what it wants to do, to spread madness where it wants to spread madness. We could think of the One Ring in Lord of the Rings as a comparable parallel, right? The idea that it moves through different owners with some sort of larger cosmic purpose in mind. Chambers seems to conceptualize the metatextual King in Yellow as doing the same type of thing. So what exactly the King in Yellow is about, we don't know. And possibly Chambers didn't write it because he could not write something that would spread like plague throughout the world, causing madness in whoever reads it. Possibly he didn't write it because he didn't really want to create something that could spread like plague and cause madness in whoever reads it. But whatever it is, whatever the reason, we don't have the actual thing itself. We have some general sense of vaguely what it's about. It seems to be a kind of Gothic story set in, again, a sort of cosmic horror space in which there are sort of monarchs and heroes and villains, and the space itself is strange. Different geographic formations, different atmospheric conditions, black stars, as we saw referenced, etc., etc. These sorts of things. So we don't know what the King in Yellow is, but we know its effects because of the stories Chambers has given us. And again, they're strange stories. They're not, I would say they're mostly not horror stories, which is really what I was expecting. Or if they are horror stories, they are more sort of existential horror almost, right? Like the terror of madness rather than... So I mean, in that sense, I guess there is a sort of Poe element to this, but often it is not like violence or anything like this. It's just sort of the terror of existence.